Gentlemen, join your troops.
Chatsworth, California, home to some of Hollywood's most legendary westerns, a place of open landscapes, rolling hills, and the illusion of the frontier. But under the dust of cowboy films and the ghosts of silver screen legends, a far darker truth lingers in the air, in the soil, in the water, and in the very bones of those who have lived here. Most people know Chatsworth for one story, Helter Skelter, Charles Manson's twisted prophecy that spilled blood across Los Angeles in the summer of 1969. Those crimes and their ties to Spahn Ranch still captivate the public's imagination, decades after Manson's followers carved their way into infamy. But there is another crime, one even more disturbing, one that continues to claim lives. A decade before the Manson family, in the summer of 1959, there was a nuclear meltdown at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, just a few miles from Spahn Ranch. The government never warned the people. No evacuations, no cleanup, no accountability. For decades, the residents of Chatsworth, including those who lived and worked at Spahn Ranch, breathed the fallout. Some of them are still alive, and many are not. And while Manson is gone, this contamination remains. This is the real crime of Chatsworth. Long before Hollywood cameras rolled across its rugged hills, before cowboys and outlaws shot their way into cinematic history, the land that is now Chatsworth and Simi Valley was home to the Tongva and Chumash peoples. For thousands of years, they thrived in the region, their villages nestled along the creeks and canyons, sustained by the rich ecosystem of the Santa Susana Mountains. They lived in harmony with the land, hunting small game, and trading with coastal tribes. Then came the Spanish missions, marking the beginning of European influence in the late 18th century. The land was claimed as part of the San Fernando mission, where the indigenous people were forced into labor, their way of life forever disrupted. After Mexican independence, vast tracts of this land were divided into ranchos, owned by wealthy Mexican families who used them for cattle grazing and agriculture. With California's statehood in 1850, American settlers moved in, drawn by the wide open land and the promise of prosperity. Chatsworth, officially established in 1888, became a small agricultural community known for its wheat fields, citrus orchards, and rugged, untamed beauty. The arrival of the Southern Pacific Railroad further transformed the area, connecting it to Los Angeles and bringing in new waves of settlers. By the early 20th century, Hollywood discovered Chatsworth. Its breathtaking rock formations and sprawling valleys became the ideal backdrop for silent films. Soon the town was reborn, not as farmland, but as a frontier of myth, legend, and Western cinema. Long before the land at 12,000 Santa Susana Pass Road became infamous, it was a quiet homestead shaped by settlers who saw opportunity in its rugged landscape. In the 1880s, a Mexican immigrant named Dionisio Sanchez and his business partner, James R. Williams, a Hoosier from Indiana, established a small homestead on the land. Together, their families lived off the land, raising livestock and using the trails through the Santa Susana Mountains as a vital passageway for trade and travel. In 1928, the property changed hands when it was purchased by Sharon M. Atkins. But it wasn't until 1947 that it took on a more cinematic identity. The newest owners, Lee and Ruth McReynolds, saw potential in the land's rocky cliffs and wide open spaces. And with the Iverson movie ranch nearby, they sought to capture some of Hollywood's Western film business, building movie sets next to a trading post they had constructed on the property. For a time, the land was a modest but functional piece of Hollywood's Western frontier. Then in 1948, George Spahn, a former dairy farmer and horse trainer, bought the 55-acre property and transformed it into Spahn Movie Ranch, leasing it out to film and television crews while offering horseback rides and boarding services. For a while, it thrived, but its best days were short-lived. As Hollywood's tastes shifted away from Westerns, Spahn Ranch's future became uncertain. High above Chatsworth and Simi Valley, perched in the isolated hills of Ventura County, a top-secret testing facility was built in the years following World War II. This facility, known as the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, was established in 1947 as a joint project between the U.S. government and private aerospace corporations, including Rocketdyne and Atomics International. Spanning nearly 2,800 acres, the site was used for nuclear energy research, rocket engine testing, and chemical experiments, making it one of the most important and most secretive Cold War-era research centers in the country. By the late 1950s, the lab housed 10 experimental nuclear reactors, each designed to test different reactor technologies. One of the most ambitious projects was the sodium reactor experiment, an experimental nuclear reactor designed to demonstrate the potential of using liquid sodium as a coolant rather than water. This reactor made history in 1957 when it became the first in the United States to supply nuclear-generated electricity to a commercial power grid. But just 2 years later, disaster struck. In July of 1959, the SRE reactor experienced a partial meltdown, one of the first and worst nuclear accidents in American history. Due to a malfunction in the cooling system, temperatures inside the reactor soared beyond safe limits. Within hours, 13 of the reactor's 43 fuel rods ruptured, causing the reactor core to partially melt. Unlike later nuclear disasters such as 3 Mile Island in 1979 or Chernobyl in 1986, the Santa Susana reactor had no containment structure. This meant that when the reactor failed, radioactive gases were released directly into the atmosphere. This included iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90, some of the most dangerous radioactive isotopes known. The response to the accident was swift, but not the way you might expect. Instead of alerting the public, Rocketdyne and Atomics International chose to keep the incident secret. Workers at the site were not evacuated. The public was not warned. No one outside of a small group of scientists and engineers knew that a nuclear disaster had just taken place in the hills above Los Angeles. In the immediate aftermath, engineers vented radioactive gases into the open air in an attempt to relieve pressure in the reactor. Internal documents revealed much later that these releases continued intermittently for weeks, possibly months. Despite knowing the risks, government officials and company executives deliberately chose to downplay the incident to avoid scrutiny. For decades, the true extent of the Santa Susana meltdown remained hidden. It wasn't until the late 1970s, when activists began uncovering old government reports, that the accident was publicly acknowledged. But by then, 20 years had passed, and whatever damage had been done was already in motion. By the late 1960s, the golden age of Hollywood Westerns was fading. The grand cowboy epics of the 50s were being replaced by gritty crime films, spy thrillers, and big-budget spectacles, leaving behind the once thriving movie ranches that had fueled the industry. As film crews stopped coming to Chatsworth, Spahn Ranch fell into disrepair. George Spahn, now in his late 70s, was struggling. His sight was failing, making it nearly impossible for him to see. And with no steady income from film productions, he was barely surviving. He had one dedicated ally, Ruby Pearl Molinaro, his longtime ranch forewoman. She kept the business running as best she could, overseeing the ranch hands who worked without pay, simply because there was no money to give them. Spahn owed back taxes to both the state and county, and without a miracle, the ranch would be lost. Then in the summer of 1968, a group of young drifters arrived. They were peaceful, hardworking, and eager to help. They cleaned the stables, maintained the trails, took care of the horses, and rented out pony rides to visitors. They also cooked meals, cleaned the bunkhouses, and looked after George as his health failed. For Spahn, the Manson family wasn't a threat. They were a lifeline. The old, forgotten movie film sets, now crumbling, became a sanctuary for Charlie and his family, a place of freedom, communal living, and survival. One of the newest members of the family even donated $16,000 to the cause, some of that money going to George to help him with his tax debt. Throughout 1968 and early 1969, the Manson family treated Spahn Ranch like a home. They lived simply, growing their ranks, sharing food, tending to the horses, and caring for George Spahn. The ranch was an isolated, forgotten place, allowing them to exist outside of society's rules. But as their numbers grew, so did their troubles. Food became scarce. Manson's dreams of becoming a famous musician collapsed when Terry Melcher, a record producer who had shown initial interest, ultimately rejected him. With no money, no prospects, and a growing number of mouths to feed, Manson's peaceful facade began to crack. By mid-1969, Spahn Ranch was no longer the carefree commune it had once been. Charlie wasn't just their leader, he was their law. His followers worshipped him, but the fatherly figure they once trusted was becoming paranoid, violent, and obsessed with what he called helter-skelter, a coming race war he believed ultimately he would lead. His frustration boiled over into beatings, humiliation, and intimidation. Then in July and August 1969, Manson gave the order of murder. His followers left Spahn Ranch with knives, heading into Los Angeles to commit a series of brutal murders, acts that would forever link Spahn Ranch to one of the darkest stories in American history. The Manson family were eventually linked to the murders, tried, convicted, and sentenced. But members of the family remained at Spahn Ranch, taking care of George, the animals, the land, and holding fast to the belief system so inexorably linked with Charlie. They stayed until September 1970, when a tragic fire destroyed much of Chatsworth, including many of George's livestock. Devastated, George sold what remained and moved to Oregon. 4 years later, he was dead of natural causes and a broken heart. For decades, the 1959 meltdown at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory was a buried secret. No one in Chatsworth, Simi Valley, or the surrounding areas had been warned of the radioactive gases that had been released into the air, nor had they been told about the contaminants that had seeped into the soil and groundwater. Life went on as usual. Families built homes, children played in the hills, and businesses thrived. No one knew that they had been living in the shadow of a nuclear accident. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 80s that whispers of something sinister began to spread. Activists and independent researchers started digging through old government records and found evidence of the meltdown, an event that had never been disclosed to the public. At the same time, residents began noticing a disturbing trend. Clusters of rare cancers, leukemia, and birth defects were emerging in communities near the Santa Susana site. Families who had lived in the area for decades started asking questions. Was something wrong with the land, with the water, with the air? By the 1990s, investigative journalists began bringing the story to the mainstream media. Reports surfaced of former SSFL workers developing aggressive cancers, and environmental tests confirmed dangerous levels of radioactive and chemical contamination in the surrounding area. The public demanded answers, demanded cleanup, but for years the response was slow, the resistance strong, and the accountability non-existent. What had been an invisible threat was now an undeniable crisis, one that would only continue to unfold. In the decades following the 1959 partial meltdown at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, the surrounding communities of Chatsworth, Simi Valley, and other nearby areas began to experience a troubling increase in cancer cases. Residents reported clusters of rare cancers, leukemia, and other serious health concerns, raising alarms about the long-term effects of the radiation and chemical contaminants released during the meltdown. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of this crisis has been its impact on children. Families living near the SSFL site have reported numerous cases of pediatric cancers, including rare forms of leukemia and brain tumors. The documentary In the Dark of the Valley highlights the story of a young girl diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer, prompting her mother to investigate the potential link between her illness and the proximity of their home to the contaminated site. Individuals who worked at the lab have also suffered. James Palmer, a former worker at the site, reported that out of 27 men on his crew, 22 died of cancers. Palmer recounted how he would return home from work with chemicals on his clothes, unknowingly exposing his family to harmful substances. The 1959 meltdown released various radioactive isotopes and toxic chemicals into the environment, including iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90. These substances are known to increase the risk of various cancers. The Manson family, who resided at Spahn Ranch on and off for a couple of years, which was located approximately 5 miles from the Santa Susana Field Lab, also experienced cases of cancer among its members after they left the ranch. Now, we don't know how many ranch hands might have contracted cancer. Thanks to the notoriety of the Manson crimes, many of them faded into obscurity, and little is known about their lives after 1970, or how many are still alive. While direct causation between these cancer cases and the lab contamination cannot be definitively established, the geographical proximity and the timing of these illnesses have led to increased scrutiny and concern among researchers and the public alike. The Manson family didn't just live at Spahn Ranch. They lived on Spahn Ranch, on the land. They tended the horses. They bathed and drank from the streams and did their laundry there. They also raised their children at Spahn Ranch, children who might also, because of their tender age at the time, be particularly vulnerable to the cancers we have seen in the neighboring communities young. The legacy of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory meltdown serves as a somber reminder of the long-term health consequences that can arise from environmental contamination, emphasizing the need for ongoing research, transparency, and communal advocacy to address and mitigate these risks. The tragic events of 1969, the helter-skelter murders, and the toxic influence of Charles Manson on a generation who believed in the 1960s dream have been etched into history, their perpetrators brought to justice. Yet, a more insidious threat still lingers: the enduring contamination from the 1959 meltdown at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. This ongoing crisis demands our attention and action. The California Department of Toxic Substances Control leads the regulatory oversight for the SSFL cleanup, collaborating with state, federal, and local agencies. In May 22, a significant development occurred when Cal EPA announced a comprehensive framework establishing strict cleanup protocols and timelines for the Boeing Company, one of the primary responsible parties. Despite these efforts, progress has been sluggish, and concerns about the adequacy of the cleanup persist. Several organizations have emerged as champions for the affected communities, tirelessly working to ensure a thorough and transparent cleanup. So how can you make a difference? By stepping into this role, you contribute to a legacy of resilience and responsibility, ensuring that future generations are safeguarded from the shadows of the past. After all, many of us visit what remains of Spahn Ranch, now a state historical park. We are all drawn to the legend of Spahn Ranch, to the darkness of 1969, to the stories of cults, crimes, and madness that have shaped the way we remember this land. We revisit it in books, films, and documentaries, fascinated by the myth of Helter Skelter, by the horrors that unfolded on those hot August nights. But this place is not just history, it's still here. And the crime that really impacts this historical place is still killing people. Beneath the dust of old movie sets and forgotten trails, shadowing the ghosts of Manson and his followers, there's a deeper, more insidious truth, one that doesn't live in the past, but in the very air, soil, and water of this land. People still live here, work here, raise families here, and some of them are dying here, not by knife, not by gun, but by a poison unleashed decades ago and never cleaned up. We can no longer afford to see Chatsworth, Spahn Ranch, and the Santa Susana Hills as a mere footnote in crime history. The real crime isn't over. It's happening now. Every time another child is diagnosed, every time another family loses someone they love to a cancer that never should have happened. The story of 1969 has been solved. The killers were caught, convicted, and sentenced. But the perpetrators of this crime, the crime of negligence, of greed, of burying the truth, they're still out there, and they can be held accountable. We can all do more than merely watch a tragedy unfold.